I rented a small cabin deep in the woods after weeks of stress at work. I wanted a place far from traffic, far from people, and far from anything that made noise. The listing said it was an old hunting cabin, used by the owner's family for decades. It had no neighbors, just trees, a thin gravel road, and a small lake behind it. I thought the isolation would help me clear my mind. I didn't think about how different peaceful can feel when you're alone with nothing but your own thoughts and the sounds of the forest. The cabin looked older than the photos. The wood was dark from years of weather. The porch sagged on one corner. Inside, everything smelled like dust and cold pine. The single bedroom had a thin mattress, a small table, and a dresser with uneven legs. The place looked untouched for months. I tried to ignore the strange heaviness I felt the moment I stepped inside. I told myself it was only because I wasn't used to being that far from people. My plan was simple. Stay 2 nights, rest, walk around the woods, maybe take a few pictures, then go home. The first day passed quietly. I walked the trail behind the cabin, listened to the wind in the trees, and tried to settle into the silence. But even on that first day, something felt off. The woods were oddly still. I didn't hear many animals, not even birds. Every time I stopped walking, the silence wrapped around me like a thick blanket. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy and tense, like the forest was holding its breath. When I came back to the cabin that evening, I noticed small things that bothered me. The door felt harder to open than before, as if it had swollen or shifted. The floorboards made long, slow creaks even when I wasn't moving, and the air inside seemed colder than the air outside. I kept telling myself that old cabins always have these issues, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more I found myself paying attention to every sound. By nightfall, the woods had turned completely dark. There were no lights anywhere except the small lamp I kept on the table. Outside the windows, there was only blackness. I ate a quick dinner and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows. I didn't know what I expected to see out there, but the darkness felt too thick and too close. Every few minutes I glanced up again, checking the glass to make sure nothing was moving outside. When I finally went to bed, I left the lamp on. The cabin groaned with every small gust of wind. I tried closing my eyes, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. I felt watched, even though I knew there was no one out there. It took a long time, but eventually I drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight with a strange feeling in my chest. Not pain, just a tightness, like I had been holding my breath. The cabin was cold. The air felt sharp, almost metallic. I tried to listen for anything unusual, but the whole place was silent except for a faint ticking sound. At first I thought it was coming from the lamp, but then I realized it wasn't mechanical. It sounded more like something lightly tapping on wood. I stayed still, listening hard. The tapping continued for a few seconds, stopped, then started again. A slow, irregular rhythm. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I looked toward the door, the windows, the corners of the room, but nothing moved. I tried to tell myself it was a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound was too close and too crisp. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I lay awake for hours, listening to it come and go. Sometimes it sounded lower, like it was near the floor. Sometimes it was higher, closer to the roof. The more I listened, the more I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. Something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't random like an animal. It felt intentional, like a small pattern that kept restarting. When the sun finally came up, the tapping stopped. The silence returned, but it didn't feel like relief. It felt like something had gone still, waiting. I got out of bed slowly, my legs stiff from fear more than sleep. I walked around the cabin, checking the windows, the door, the walls. Nothing looked disturbed. I stepped outside and looked around the cabin, but there were no visible marks, no branches touching the wood. Everything looked normal, but my nerves were already shot. I tried to calm down by taking another walk, but the forest felt even quieter than the day before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was behind me even though every time I turned, the trail was empty. When I got back, the air inside the cabin was colder again, and the heavy feeling returned immediately. The place didn't feel like a place to rest anymore. It felt like a place I shouldn't have entered. As the second night came, I debated leaving early, but the gravel road was narrow and rough, and driving on it in the dark felt risky. I convinced myself I was being dramatic and decided to stay until morning. That was a mistake. When night fell, the cabin felt even smaller. I left the lamp on again. I couldn't stand the idea of sitting in the dark. I tried to keep my mind on something normal, but the tapping started again, earlier than the night before. It was faint at first, like something brushing the wood. Then it grew sharper, like nails or fingertips on boards. The sound moved slowly around the cabin, from one wall to another. I sat completely still, my body frozen with fear. My breathing was shallow and shaky. The tapping paused, then started again behind the bedroom wall. I could feel a faint vibration through the mattress. It made the whole room feel alive. I didn't sleep at all. I sat upright in the bed, watching the door and the window, waiting for the noise to stop. Didn't. It stayed faint, but constant all the way until the sky started turning gray. As soon as there was enough light to see the trees, I packed everything I had and got ready to leave. I didn't care about breakfast, I didn't care about cleaning, I didn't care about anything except getting out. My hands shook every time I touched something. I kept looking at the walls, expecting the noise to start again. When I stepped outside, something caught my eye on the far side of the cabin near the back window. The wood looked different there, not scratched or broken, but rubbed. The surface of the planks was smoother than the rest, like something had leaned or pressed against it repeatedly. The marks were too low for a person and too wide for an animal. They looked like the shape of a shoulder or a back, pressed into the cabin over and over again. I didn't stay long enough to study it. I got in my car and drove out as fast as I safely could. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, but the pressure in my chest stayed the whole drive home. For a few days, I tried to forget about it. I kept telling myself it was an animal, a structural issue, or just my mind exaggerating things because I was alone. But the memory wouldn't fade. The cold air, the tapping inside the walls, the rubbed wood, the way the cabin felt heavier every hour I stayed there. A week later, curiosity pushed me to look up more information about the area. I found a small forum where hunters talked about strange activity in the same woods. Not supernatural things, but stories about people finding signs of someone living out there. Not a normal camper or hiker, someone who avoided everyone. Someone who moved quietly and stayed close to older structures. Someone no one ever saw clearly, but everyone swore was real. Some hunters said they found signs near old cabins. Rubbed wood, small holes near the base of walls, small footprints that weren't from boots. Others mentioned tapping sounds at night, the same pattern restarting again and again. They believed the person watched cabins from the tree line, waited for people to leave, and sometimes got close enough to press against the walls to listen. Reading that made my stomach twist. Suddenly, everything made sense in the worst way possible. The cold air in the cabin wasn't just the old building. The tapping in the walls wasn't an animal. And the rubbed wood behind the bedroom wasn't weather. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching the cabin long before I arrived. Someone had probably watched me walk in, watched me sleep, and stayed close to the wall during both nights I was there. The ending was clear to me after that. I wasn't alone in that cabin. I was never alone. And whatever was moving around those walls wasn't a ghost or a story. It was a real person who lived in those woods, who knew those cabins better than anyone, and who wasn't afraid to come right up to them in the middle of the night. I never went back, and I never rented another isolated cabin again. I had rented the cabin because I thought I needed distance from everything in my life. I had been working long hours, sleeping in strange patterns, and moving through each week like I was stuck on repeat. When I found a small cabin listing online, deep in the woods, cheap, no neighbors, I booked it without thinking too hard. I wanted silence. I wanted a place where my phone would barely work and where no one could bother me. I wanted to feel disconnected from the world for a few days. The ride there took much longer than I expected. The road turned narrow and rough after a while, with tall trees crowding both sides. The air grew colder as I drove farther in, and fog kept sliding across the road in slow waves. My GPS lost signal near the last bend, forcing me to rely on the printed instructions I had brought. I remember thinking it added to the charm, the way old places feel when technology stops working and you have to rely on your own senses again. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking. The place was smaller than in the pictures, sitting low to the ground with a dark roof and a small deck facing the woods. There were no houses in sight, no sounds except the wind pushing through the trees. It felt empty in a comfortable way, like the kind of quiet that makes your mind slow down. Inside, the air smelled like wood and dust. The floors creaked under my weight, and the walls felt thin, as if the cold could slip right through. There was a living room with an old fireplace, a tiny kitchen, one bedroom, and a narrow hallway leading to a back door that stuck when I pushed it. I set my bags down, lit the lantern I brought, and tried to settle in. The first night went quietly. I cooked, walked around the clearing for a bit, and then sat on the deck watching the woods turn darker and darker until they became one big shape. I could hear things moving out there, probably animals, but nothing unusual. When I went inside for the night, the silence wrapped around me so tightly that I felt like I was underwater. I slept lightly but without trouble. It was the second day when things started feeling wrong. I woke up early, made coffee, and stepped outside. The ground was damp, and small patches of mist drifted between the trees. When I walked around the cabin, I found something strange behind it. Footprints. Not animal prints. Shoe prints. They were faint but clear enough to see the tread pattern. They led from the tree line straight toward the cabin and stopped near the back wall, right by the window of the bedroom I had slept in. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to understand. Could have been an old trail from someone who used to stay here. Maybe a hiker or a hunter had walked by days or weeks before. The prints looked a bit fresh, but the ground was always damp here. It was probably nothing. I tried to calm myself with that thought and went back inside, but the feeling stayed with me all day. I moved around the cabin trying to distract myself. Reading, cooking, cleaning, but I kept glancing at the windows, listening to any noise outside. Every small sound felt sharper than before, like the woods had become aware of me. Even inside, I felt exposed, like someone could be watching through the thin curtains. Later that afternoon, while gathering wood near the tree line, I found something else. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a low branch. Dark, almost black. It looked like part of a jacket. The branch wasn't sharp enough to rip cloth easily, so whoever left it must have moved fast or panicked. The footprints from earlier came back into my mind immediately. I took the wood inside and locked the door, even though it was still daylight. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Old cabins always have leftover things like that. People come and go, leaving behind scraps. Nothing about it had to be unusual. When night came, the unease grew heavier. The wind picked up and kept slamming against the walls, and the trees made long shadows that shifted each time the lantern flickered. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The more I tried to ignore the feeling, the stronger it pressed against me. Sometime after midnight, I heard something outside. It was soft at first, mixed with the wind, but clear enough for me to know it wasn't an animal. It sounded like someone stepping on the wooden deck. Slow, careful steps pressed down one at a time. The boards creaked under the weight and then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. It felt like someone was standing just outside the cabin, listening. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. The room felt colder. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. After what felt like minutes, something scraped lightly against the outer wall, close to the bedroom window. Not like claws, like fingers. I didn't move. I didn't reach for anything. I just lay there staring into the darkness, terrified that any sound I made would give away exactly where I was. The scraping happened again. Slow, careful, like someone testing the wall. Then the deck creaked again, footsteps moving away, fading until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed awake until morning. When light finally came through the window, I got up and checked the outside. There were fresh shoe prints again, clearer this time. They circled the cabin, stopped at the deck, and then headed back toward the woods. The distance between each step seemed long, like the person moved quickly once they stepped off the deck. I stood there staring at them, feeling sick. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had walked right up to it in the middle of the night. Someone had touched the wall next to where I slept. I packed my things fast, but part of me wanted answers before leaving. I couldn't stand the idea of just running without knowing what was out there, even though fear pushed hard against my ribs. I walked a few feet into the woods, following the prints. They were spaced farther apart now. Whoever it was had been running. After about 20 steps, the prints suddenly stopped between two trees. They didn't fade out, they just ended like the person had jumped onto something or changed direction onto harder ground. I looked around and then noticed a narrow path I hadn't seen before, almost hidden by leaves and branches. It led deeper into the woods, winding downhill. The prints didn't continue onto it, but something about the path felt wrong. The ground there was disturbed in places, like someone had walked over it many times before, but not recently enough to leave clean prints. I didn't go farther. I turned around and headed back to the cabin, grabbed my bag, locked the door even though it didn't matter, and got in my car. The feeling that someone was nearby stayed with me until I reached the main road. I didn't stop once on the entire drive back. Later that week, after I had returned home and tried to move past everything, I looked up the area out of curiosity, trying to make sense of what happened. There were no stories about ghosts or strange sightings, nothing supernatural, but I found a short, old article buried in the local news archives. It mentioned hikers in that region reporting a man who lived illegally in the woods years ago. He would stay near abandoned cabins or in used properties, stealing food, tools, clothing, anything left behind. Some hikers said they felt watched or found footprints around their camps. The article didn't say if he was ever caught. Reading that helped the pieces fall into place in a way that felt horrible but real. Someone had been using the cabin when renters weren't there. Someone had probably expected it to be empty when I arrived. Someone who lived out there, moving quietly, watching from the trees, waiting for his chance to get close. The footprints, the fabric, the scraping on the wall, it was all a person, not something supernatural. That made it worse in a way because real people can be unpredictable. Real people can be dangerous. Real people don't need to follow any kind of rule or pattern. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't call the owner or try to warn anyone, because I didn't want to relive it. I didn't want to explain the fear I felt when those footsteps stopped outside my window. I didn't want to imagine what might have happened if I had made a sound that night or stepped outside to check. The ending is simple and clear. I got out before anything worse happened. I survived because I stayed quiet, stayed still, and left the moment the sun came up. There was no mystery left to solve, no hidden meaning behind the noises. Just a stranger in the woods who watched a cabin in the dark and walked away only because I didn't give him a reason to come inside. And knowing how close it came, that is the part that still sits with me. I booked a small cabin deep in the woods because I wanted a break from everything. My job had been draining me, and I felt like I couldn't think straight anymore. The cabin looked simple in the listing. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, old wooden porch, and a view of a nearby stream. The owner said it was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for resting. At first, that sounded exactly like what I needed, but the moment I arrived, I realized there was something strange about the place. The road to the cabin was narrow and rough, full of potholes and loose gravel. The trees grew so close to the road that the branches brushed against my car windows. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the whole place felt old. The wooden planks were faded and gray. Weeds grew high around the porch steps. The windows were dusty, like they hadn't been cleaned in months. The forest around it felt heavy and closed in, almost like it was holding its breath. It wasn't peaceful in the way I expected. It felt like the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound your body makes. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, a cold draft hit me even though it was warm outside. The air smelled like damp wood and something metallic. The floor creaked under every step. The cabin looked empty in a way that felt deeper than just being unused. The bed was pushed against the far wall, the mattress thin and slightly dented in the middle. The kitchen had only a few cabinets and an old stove that looked like it barely worked. There was one window near the bed, another near the small table, and both faced the woods. I tried to shrug off the strange feeling and told myself I just wasn't used to being alone in the middle of nowhere. I unpacked slowly, setting my things on the table. As I moved around the cabin, I noticed something that made me pause. The window near the bed had smudge marks on the outside. They were faint, but you could see them clearly if the light hit at the right angle. They weren't fingerprints. They looked more like the marks left by someone leaning their forehead or cheek against the glass for a long time. The thought of how they got there made my stomach twist, but I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to overthink anything on my first day. To calm myself, I decided to walk around the property. The stream behind the cabin was quiet, only making a soft trickling sound as water moved over smooth stones. The forest floor was covered with pine needles, and every step felt cushioned. The air smelled fresh, and for a moment I actually felt relaxed. But as I walked further, I noticed something else unusual. Behind the cabin, near the tree line, the ground was disturbed. There were small patches of dirt that looked recently scraped. They weren't animal tracks. They were too wide, too flat, almost like someone had sat or knelt there repeatedly over time. Some patches even had small indentations that looked like the shape of knees or elbows. I tried not to think about it too much. The longer I stayed outside, the more I felt like the trees were watching me. I turned back toward the cabin, and as soon as it came into view, a cold feeling crawled up my back. The windows looked darker than they should have, as if something was blocking the light from inside. But when I got closer, the cabin was empty, just as I left it. The darkness was just a trick of the angle. Still, the uneasiness stayed with me. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker much faster than I expected. The tall trees blocked most of the light, and the cabin felt buried in shadows. I turned on the single lamp near the bed, and the warm glow made the place feel slightly safer. I made a quick meal and sat on the bed, listening to the quiet. That was when I noticed how strange the silence really was. There were no insects buzzing, no birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush. It felt unnatural, like the whole forest was frozen. Hours passed. The darkness outside thickened. The lamp flickered a few times, but I ignored it. I tried reading, but I kept glancing at the window. Every time I looked, I expected to see something staring in. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was close, something watching the cabin from just beyond the edge of the trees. At some point during the night, I laid down and tried to sleep. I didn't close the lamp. Couldn't. The silence was too heavy. I kept my eyes half open for a long time, just listening to my own breathing and the soft ticking sound the lamp made. When I finally drifted into a light sleep, I woke up almost immediately. Something was moving. It wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It was a slow, careful sound, like weight shifting on old wood. For a moment I thought it was the cabin settling, but then I heard it again. A soft but definite creak from the wall near the window. Then another, slightly lower, like someone leaning against the outside wall and adjusting their position. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, from just inches away on the other side of the wall. It wasn't random. It wasn't wind. It felt like something alive pressing against the cabin, trying to stay quiet but not quiet enough. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds between the faint creaks. Sometimes they came quickly, sometimes with long pauses in between. The worst part was how soft they were. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying not to be heard. They were moving carefully, pressing lightly, testing the wall. The sound traveled from the wall near the window to the corner of the cabin. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It felt like something was right outside, listening to the inside of the cabin as closely as I was listening to the outside. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed frozen until the first light of morning touched the window. When I finally gathered the courage to step outside, the air was cold enough to make my skin sting. I walked slowly around the cabin, my stomach tight. When I reached the side where I heard the sounds, my breath caught in my throat. The dirt near the wall was disturbed. There were shallow impressions, two knee-shaped dents in the soil and a faint line that could have been the drag of a forearm. On the wooden wall, there were smooth rubbed patches just under the window, the same kind you'd see if someone leaned their shoulder or head against the boards for a long time. I backed away, my hands shaking. Every instinct told me to leave, but part of me thought maybe it was an animal or something else. I didn't want to accept the idea of a person outside the cabin all night long, pressing against the wall, staying low, staying quiet. I tried to last one more night so I wouldn't have to drive down the dangerous road in the dark if something happened. Looking back now, that was a stupid decision. The second night was worse, much worse. The darkness outside felt heavier, almost like the forest was waiting for me to fall asleep. I sat on the bed with the lamp on, staring at the window. Every shadow looked like it was moving. Every small sound made my skin crawl. Hours passed before the creaking began again. This time it started near the back of the cabin. Soft pressure against the wood. Then another shift. Then another. Slow, careful movements like someone crawling along the outer wall. The creaks traveled around the corner, toward the bedroom window, toward me. I felt frozen in place. My body wouldn't move no matter how much I wanted to run out the door. The slow creaking grew clearer, more deliberate. I could feel the faint vibrations through the floorboards. Something pressed against the wall directly beneath the window, the same spot where I saw the marks earlier. Minutes passed with only the faint sounds of pressure against the wood. Then silence. A deep, heavy silence that felt like breath being held on both sides of the wall. When morning finally came, I didn't hesitate. I packed everything in minutes and ran to my car. Before I left, I took one final look at the side of the cabin. The marks were clearer this time. Fresh smudges on the wood, fresh knee prints in the soil, and something else. Two faint handprints pressed into the dirt, small and narrow, facing the cabin, positioned like someone had been crouched there, staring into the window. In that moment, the entire truth hit me in one cold wave. It wasn't the cabin making noise. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't wind. Someone had been coming to the cabin at night. Someone small. Someone patient. Someone who stayed close to the walls, listening carefully, watching silently through the window. Someone who had probably been doing this long before I arrived and would continue long after. I drove away from that place without looking back. The ending was painfully clear to me. There was a person living in those woods, unseen, silent, and watching. They weren't breaking in. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were simply observing, night after night, pressing against the walls and windows just to listen. And the thought that they might still be there, waiting for the next person to rent that cabin, is something that stays with me even now. I drove up to the old cabin late in the afternoon, thinking it would be a quiet weekend away from everything. The place belonged to a friend who said I could use it whenever I wanted. I had been working nonstop for weeks, and I felt burned out, drained in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from any town, far from the noise of cars, phones, and people. I thought a few days alone would clear my head. The road leading to the cabin turned rough near the end. Pine needles and broken branches covered the ground, and every bump made my truck shake. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked smaller than I remembered. It sat low, with a steep roof and dark wooden walls that had faded from years of sun and rain. The windows were dusty. The porch had a long crack running through one of the boards. When I stepped out of the truck, the air felt colder than it should have been for that season. I carried my bag inside and closed the door behind me. The inside smelled like old wood and dry dirt. It wasn't dirty, just stale, as if no one had opened it in months. There was a single bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove that had rust around the edges. I dropped my things, opened a few windows to let air in, and walked back outside to take in the quiet. The clearing around the cabin was wide but surrounded by thick trees. The sun was low, and the light pushed through the branches in long, narrow beams. It looked peaceful at first, but after standing there for a minute, I felt something off, like the air was holding its breath. No wind moved through the trees. No birds made a sound. Even the insects seemed to be hiding. I tried to ignore the feeling, I told myself I was tired from the long week. I walked around the cabin, checking the sides, the back wall, the small shed behind it. Everything looked untouched. But when I stepped near the shed, I noticed footprints in the dirt. They were faint, but they were definitely recent. They weren't mine. They weren't from my friend either. He hadn't been here in over a year. The prints looked like someone had been walking slowly around the cabin. The shape was unclear, but they were long, like someone had big boots on. I stared at them for a long time. I tried to tell myself they were old, that maybe rain had hardened them in a strange way. But the edges were sharp, like they had been made within a day or two. I went back inside, feeling a heaviness I couldn't shake. The light was fading fast, and I didn't want to overthink things. I lit a small lantern, boiled water for a simple meal, and tried to distract myself by unpacking. But my mind kept going back to the footprints. When night settled in, the cabin felt smaller. The wooden walls creaked with the shift in temperature. The wind finally picked up a little, brushing against the windows. I tried to read a book, but I found myself starting at every small sound. Around 11, I turned off the lantern and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The darkness inside the cabin was thick, and the air felt colder than earlier. I pulled the blanket up and tried to fall asleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up suddenly with a tight feeling in my chest. I didn't know why I woke up. It felt like my body reacted before my mind did. I stayed still, breathing quietly, listening. First, I heard nothing. Then I heard a slow, heavy crunch outside, someone stepping on dried leaves. I felt my heartbeat slam against my ribs. I kept my eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to make sense of the sound. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps were slow and spaced apart, like someone taking careful, deliberate strides. Then I heard a second set of steps, softer, like someone was dragging their feet. The steps stopped right outside the cabin. I held my breath without meaning to. My mouth felt dry. I waited, hoping it was my imagination. But then I heard the wooden porch creak. Just once, like a single foot had pressed down on it. My skin crawled. The porch was old, but it only creaked when a real weight was on it. For a long time, nothing happened. There was no knock, no voice, no movement, just silence. I lay there, frozen, feeling the cold air press against my face. Then, slowly, the porch creaked again, and again, like someone was shifting their weight or taking tiny steps across it. I could picture them standing just inches from the door, maybe watching the windows, maybe listening for movement inside. I stayed completely still. My muscles ached from the tension. I tried to think of what I would do if the door opened, but my mind felt blank. I didn't have a gun. I didn't have any real weapon. The closest thing I had was a heavy flashlight, but that didn't comfort me much. After what felt like a long time, the sounds faded. No more steps, no more porch creaks. I stayed awake until the first light appeared faintly through the windows. Only then did I move. My legs were stiff as I stood and walked to the window, lifting the curtain slowly. The porch was empty. The clearing was quiet. Everything looked normal. But when I opened the door and stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints on the porch. Big ones, the same shape I saw behind the cabin earlier. They led down the steps and toward the trees, but they didn't go in a straight line. They curved around the cabin, looping near the back before disappearing into the thick woods. My stomach turned when I realized the person must have walked around the cabin for a while before coming to the front door. I packed my things fast. I didn't bother eating or cleaning up. I grabbed everything and threw it into the truck. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared louder than normal in the quiet morning. As I drove down the old path, I kept checking the rearview mirror. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a dark shape standing still. I didn't slow down to check. I kept driving until the road widened and the trees thinned out. When I reached the main road, the tension finally eased a little. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I was miles away. Later that day, when I told my friend about it, he said the cabin had a strange past. Not ghosts or anything supernatural, just stories about people passing through the woods, staying out there without anyone knowing, living in makeshift shelters. He said the area was so remote that people sometimes camped out there for weeks without being noticed. He said these woods had a way of attracting the wrong kind of people. That night, when I tried to sleep in my own bed, the quiet of my house felt different. Safer, but not fully. My mind kept going back to the footprints circling the cabin, the slow steps on the porch, the way the person didn't knock or try to talk. They were just there, watching, waiting, maybe curious, maybe planning something worse. I didn't go back to that cabin after that. I told myself it wasn't worth it, no matter how peaceful I thought it would be. Real danger doesn't need to make noise or show itself. Sometimes it just stands in the dark, a few inches from a thin wooden wall, listening to you breathe. And when I think about that night, the part that stays with me most is how careful the footsteps were. How slow, how controlled. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They weren't wandering. They knew exactly what they were doing. And they were comfortable being that close to a place they thought was empty. I wasn't supposed to be there, but clearly someone else thought they were. I drove up to the cabin on a late Friday afternoon, thinking I finally had the whole weekend to myself. I'd been feeling drained for months, like I was stuck in the same routine every day. When a coworker offered me his family's small cabin for a couple of days, I accepted without thinking twice. I didn't even check photos. I just wanted to get away from noise, people, and everything that felt heavy on my shoulders. The cabin was deep in the woods, far off the main road. The last stretch of the drive was a narrow dirt path with more potholes than smooth ground. My truck bounced the whole way until the trees finally opened into a small clearing. The cabin sat in the middle of it, small, dark, and almost blending into the tree line behind it. The porch sagged a little on one side. The roof was covered in pine needles, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. When I stepped out of the truck, the air hit me first. It was colder than I expected, sharp and still. No wind, no birds, no insects buzzing around. It was too quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the woods were watching me. I told myself I was just tired. I unpacked slowly, walking up the old steps that groaned under my weight. The door stuck a little before opening, and when I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. It wasn't filthy, just abandoned feeling, like no one had lived there for a long time. The inside was simple. A bed against the far wall, a small table, a wood stove, and a tiny kitchen area. There were deep scratches on the wooden floor near the door, but I figured they were from old furniture or maybe a dog someone used to bring here. I opened the windows to air the place out and set my bag on the bed. After a few minutes, I walked around the clearing to get a feel for the place. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. Behind the cabin, where the trees grew closer, the dirt looked disturbed. At first, it seemed like animal tracks, but when I crouched down, I saw a long trail of footprints. Heavy, uneven, and definitely human. They looked recent. The ground still had a little moisture from rain earlier that week, and the edges of the prints were sharp. Whoever made them had walked back and forth behind the cabin multiple times. It wasn't a straight path. It curved, crossed itself, then looped around the side of the building. Something about that made my chest tighten a little. I didn't like the idea of someone wandering around the cabin days before I showed up, but I tried not to overthink it. Maybe hunters passed through. Maybe someone used the woods as a shortcut. I didn't see anyone, and the woods looked empty as far as I could see. I went back inside before the sun got too low. The forest darkened faster than the sky. By the time the sun touched the tree line, the clearing looked like a shadowy bowl, and the cabin felt even more isolated. I made a simple meal, listened to the small pops from the wood stove, and tried to relax. I kept noticing little sounds though, soft cracks outside, faint shifting noises, like something brushing against the ground. Every time I paused to listen, the cabin felt like it held its breath. When night finally settled completely, darkness wrapped around the cabin like a curtain. The windows turned black, and the air grew colder inside. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the stove's last bits of heat fade away. The silence outside felt too thick, almost unnatural. I don't know how long I slept, but sometime deep in the night, I woke up instantly, like my body reacted before I even knew why. My eyes opened into complete darkness, and I felt heavy pressure in my chest. The kind that comes from fear, not sickness. I didn't move at first. I just listened. First, I thought it was nothing. Then I heard a soft crunch outside. Then another. Slow, careful steps pressing down on dry ground. Footsteps. Someone was walking around the cabin. My heartbeat pushed into my throat. I stayed perfectly still, trying to breathe without making a sound. The steps grew a little clearer, moving slowly around the side of the cabin. The way the boards creaked inside, I could tell exactly how close the person was. They weren't rushing. They weren't calling out. They were just walking, slow and measured, like they were studying the building. Then the steps stopped right outside the window near the bed. Even though I couldn't see anything, I felt the presence of someone standing there. The darkness felt different in that spot. Heavier, like a shape was blocking the faint moonlight that should have filtered through the trees. I felt sweat forming on my forehead even though the air was freezing. I wanted to move, but my body was locked. All I could do was listen to my own breathing, quiet and uneven. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then more steps, 2 slow ones, then stillness again. It sounded like the person was circling the cabin, checking each wall, each window. At one point, the steps reached the front porch. The wooden boards let out a long, soft groan as someone put their full weight on it. My chest tightened so sharply I felt dizzy. I waited for a knock, a voice, something, but none came. Instead, the person took one more step, then stopped again. I pictured someone standing right in front of the door, listening. At some point, the steps finally moved away, quiet, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there until the faintest morning light reached the windows. When I got up, my legs felt weak. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The air was freezing, and the clearing looked dull under the early light. When I walked around to the side of the cabin, my stomach twisted. Fresh footprints circled the entire building. Not just once, multiple loops, back and forth. Sometimes right up against the wall, so close the heel marks touched the foundation. The prints behind the cabin, where I saw them the day before, were now deeper and more spread out, as if someone had stood there for a long time during the night. I followed the trail to the tree line, but it vanished into the woods. Whoever it was, they didn't use a path. They walked straight into the thickest part of the forest. The cabin suddenly felt too exposed, too open. I didn't bother making breakfast or cleaning up. I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and drove out of the clearing as fast as the rough path allowed. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. Even when I reached the main road, the feeling didn't fully leave. The woods on either side looked calm and empty, but after what happened, I knew the emptiness was a lie. Someone had been there. Someone had walked around the cabin in the dark without saying a word, without making their presence known in any normal way. When I got home, I sat on the couch for a long time trying to process what happened. It didn't feel like a dream. The footprints were real. The steps on the porch were real. The controlled way the person moved, never rushing, never talking, felt too purposeful to be random. Later, I found out from someone who knew the area that people sometimes lived off-grid in those woods. Not campers, not hikers, people who didn't want to be found. People who stayed hidden and watched anyone who came too close. Maybe the person thought the cabin was empty. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they were checking who had shown up in their quiet part of the forest. Or maybe they were deciding something worse. I'll never know. And that's the part that still bothers me. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Because the scariest part of that night wasn't the footsteps, or the silence, or the cold air pressing against the windows. It was the simple fact that someone had walked around that cabin in complete darkness, circles and circles, slow and patient, like they had all the time in the world. And they never tried to talk, never knocked, never made themselves known. They were just there, watching, listening, waiting. And if I hadn't woken up when I did, I still wonder how close they would have gotten, and what they were really planning.